a ruthless underboss of the Moretti crime syndicate, hasn't shed a single tear in 5 brutal years. But when his state-of-the-art security cameras capture 2 starving, dirt-smudged 4-year-olds breaking into his heavily guarded Long Island estate just to steal a loaf of bread, the monster breaks. Because those ocean blue eyes staring back at the barrel of his loaded gun don't belong to strangers. They belong to the only woman he ever truly loved, the woman he buried 5 years ago. The storm rolling off the Long Island Sound battered the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of Matteo Moretti's study. It was past 3 in the morning. Thunder rattled the heavy mahogany doors of the Muttontown estate, but Matteo barely registered the noise. He sat behind his desk, nursing a glass of 20-year-old Macallan, staring blankly at the shipping ledgers spread before him. At 32, Matteo was the undisputed head of the Moretti family, a syndicate that controlled the docks from Red Hook to Newark. He was a man chiseled from marble and violence, possessing a reputation so terrifying that his mere presence emptied rooms. Yet, in the suffocating silence of his 70-acre fortress, he was nothing but a ghost haunting his own life. Suddenly, the encrypted console on his desk flashed a harsh, pulsing crimson. Matteo's gray eyes narrowed. It wasn't the perimeter alarm, the 10-foot electrified fences, and the armed patrols of ex-military contractors were untouched. The breach was internal. Zone 4. The East Wing kitchen and pantry. He didn't call down to his men. If someone had bypassed the outer perimeter and infiltrated the main house, there was a leak in his inner circle. Slowly making no sound, Matteo slid the customized Glock 19 from his desk drawer. He racked the slide, the metallic click swallowed by another crack of thunder, and slipped out of the study. He moved through the sprawling, darkened corridors of the mansion like a shadow. His bare feet made zero sound against the imported Carrara marble. Every instinct honed by years of surviving assassination attempts in turf wars was on high alert. He expected a team of heavily armed hitmen from the Costa family. He expected a bloodbath. He reached the arched entrance of the massive commercial-grade kitchen. The heavy oak door of the walk-in pantry was ajar, spilling a thin sliver of pale light across the floorboards. Matteo raised his weapon, his finger hovering over the trigger. He mirrored the edge of the door frame, controlling his breathing, and pivoted swiftly into the doorway, aiming the Glock directly at center mass. "Don't move!" His voice was a lethal, gravelly whisper. There was a sharp gasp, followed by the clatter of a heavy glass jar hitting the floor. But the targets didn't return fire. They didn't even reach for weapons. Matteo blinked his brain, struggling to process the scene before him. Sitting on the cold tiles, surrounded by half-opened bags of imported Italian pastries, a massive wheel of Parmigiano Reggiano and a scattered loaf of sourdough bread were 2 children. They couldn't have been older than 4. One was a girl, her frail shoulders trembling violently beneath an oversized, filthy gray sweater that swallowed her tiny frame. Her blonde hair was matted with mud and leaves her face smeared with dirt and the remnants of a stolen jar of peanut butter. Beside her, standing with his small fists clenched, was a boy. He was just as malnourished, his jeans frayed and stained, but he had thrown his fragile body in front of the little girl, shielding her from the towering armed man in the doorway. Matteo stood frozen, the Glock suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "Don't shoot her!" The little boy squeaked, his voice cracking with a terrifying mixture of pure fear and desperate bravado. "Take me! I broke the window. She's just hungry. Please, mister." Matteo slowly lowered the gun. His chest tightened, a strange, suffocating pressure building behind his ribs. He stepped fully into the light of the pantry. As the boy looked up at him, the harsh overhead light caught the child's face. Matteo stopped breathing. The boy possessed a mess of dark, unruly hair, but it was his eyes that sent a violent shockwave through Matteo's nervous system. They were a piercing, unmistakable shade of ocean blue. They were the exact same shape, the exact same defiant spark. He looked from the boy to the little girl, peeking out from behind her brother. The girl possessed Mateo's own slate-gray eyes set into a soft, heart-shaped face that he had memorized in another lifetime. "Who?" Mateo choked out the word, tearing at his throat. He dropped the gun. It clattered uselessly against the tiles. "Who are you?" The little boy swallowed hard, keeping his arms out wide to protect his sister. "I'm Leo. This is Mia. We're sorry we stole your food. Please don't kill us." Leo. Mia. The names hit Mateo like a physical blow. 5 years ago, in a tiny apartment in Astoria, a woman had laid her head on his chest, tracing circles over his heart. "If it's a boy, Leo," she had whispered in the dark. "If it's a girl, Mia. Promise me, Mateo." Mateo's knees gave out. The ruthless mafia boss, a man who had ordered the executions of dozens who had built an empire on blood and fear, collapsed onto the kitchen floor. He reached out with trembling hands, staring at the two terrified children. "Lily," he whispered, his voice shattering. "You're Lily's babies." Leo's blue eyes widened in shock. "How do you know our mommy's name?" A guttural, agonizing sob ripped its way out of Mateo's chest. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated anguish that had been locked away for half a decade. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking violently as he wept on the floor of the pantry surrounded by stolen food and the two ghosts of a life he thought had been burned to ashes on the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway. Heavy footsteps pounded down the hallway. "Boss!" Gino Mateo's most trusted capo burst into the kitchen, a customized assault rifle strapped to his chest, flanked by two breathless security guards. They swept the room, muzzles flashing, but froze when they reached the pantry. Gino's jaw dropped. The sight of his Don, a man who hadn't flinched when a bullet grazed his skull 2 years prior, on his knees weeping openly in front of two emaciated toddlers, paralyzed the seasoned enforcer. "Boss?" Gino asked, his voice losing its gruff edge. What the hell is this?" Mateo wiped his face with the back of his hand, his eyes bloodshot but suddenly burning with a ferocious, feral intensity. He looked up at Gino. "Put the guns away. Tell the chef to get down here right now. I want hot soup, I want grilled cheese, I want every piece of fresh fruit we have." "Mateo, how did they—" "I said put the guns away!" Mateo roared, the commanding, terrifying volume of his voice, making the little girl Mia whimper and press harder against her brother. Instantly, Mateo's demeanor softened. He held his hands up, showing his empty palms to the children. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I won't yell anymore. Nobody's going to hurt you. I swear it on my life." 10 minutes later, the massive marble island in the center of the kitchen was covered in a feast. The twins sat on high bar stools, their tiny legs dangling as they devoured tomato soup and buttery sandwiches with a ferocity that broke Mateo's heart all over again. He sat across from them, untouched glass of water in his hand, just watching them. Every time Leo chewed, his jawline mirrored Mateo's. Every time Mia blinked, Lily's gentle spirit radiated from her face. Gino stood silently in the corner, his arms crossed, watching the scene with deep unease. He had recognized the eyes, too. Anyone who knew Mateo 5 years ago would recognize them. 5 years ago, Lily Sullivan had been a bright-eyed nursing student at Mount Sinai. Mateo had been bleeding out in an alley in Washington Heights after a deal gone wrong. She hadn't called the cops. She had dragged him into her car, stitched him up on her kitchen table, and stubbornly refused to let him leave until the fever broke. She was the only pure thing in his rotting world. He had tried to keep her separate from the syndicate, but his enemies had found out. The report said it was a car bomb on the BQE. The police had found her charred necklace in the wreckage of the burned-out sedan. Mateo had buried an empty casket and spent the next 3 years painting New York red in retaliation. "Leo," Mateo said softly, waiting for the boy to finish a bite of bread. "Can you tell me how you got here? Where is your mother?" Leo stopped chewing. He looked down at his dirty hands, his lower lip trembling. Mia stopped eating too, clutching a napkin tightly. Mommy said we had to hide. Leo whispered, his voice small in the cavernous room. She said the scary men were looking for us again. We were sleeping in the car. It was really cold. Mateo's jaw tightened. Where's the car, Leo? In the trees, far away. Leo pointed a tiny grease-stained finger toward the window, out into the stormy darkness of the Muttontown Preserve. Mommy told us to stay under the blankets. She said she was going to get us food. She kissed us, and she locked the doors. When was this, buddy? Gino chimed in gently from the corner. 3 sleeps ago, Mia whispered, speaking for the first time. Her voice was a fragile bell that made Mateo's heart ache. Mommy didn't come back. We got too hungry. Leo broke the car window with a rock. 3 days. They had been wandering the dense woods of the preserve for 3 days in the freezing rain. Leo reached into the front pocket of his filthy jeans. He pulled out a piece of paper folded and refolded so many times the edges were tearing. Mommy told me if she ever didn't come back, I had to find a house with big gates. She gave me this. She said the man in the picture would keep us safe if we ever found him. Leo slid the crumpled paper across the marble island. Mateo picked it up with trembling fingers. He carefully unfolded the damp paper. It was a Polaroid photograph. In it, a much younger, softer Mateo was sleeping on a worn couch, and Lily was leaning over the back of it, smiling radiantly at the camera, holding up a peace sign. On the back, written in Lily's familiar, elegant handwriting, were 2 words, "Your father." The air in the kitchen evaporated. Gino stepped forward, looking over Mateo's shoulder at the photo. The capo cursed violently in Italian, stepping back and dragging a hand down his face. Mateo didn't speak. He couldn't. He looked at Leo, then at Mia, his children. He had a son. He had a daughter. They had been out there in the cold starving while he sat in a mansion drinking scotch, convinced his bloodline was dead. She's alive. Mateo whispered the words, tasting like a miracle and a curse all at once. If Lily was alive, she'd been hiding from him, or worse, hiding from the monsters she knew would never stop hunting him. The scary men came to the car before we ran away. Leo added, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. They had black jackets with a red dog on them. Gino and Mateo locked eyes. The temperature in the room instantly plummeted. A red dog. The crest of the Cerberus cartel, an underground human trafficking and extortion ring run by the Valenti brothers' men Mateo had supposedly exiled from the state 3 years ago. Mateo stood up. The weeping, broken father from the pantry vanished instantly, replaced by the ruthless apex predator of the Moretti family. Gino. Mateo's voice was dead calm, a terrifying contrast to the storm outside. Yeah, boss. Wake up the entire compound. Put the perimeter on lockdown. Call Dr. Rossi and tell him to get here in 10 minutes or I'll drag him here by his throat. I want these children examined, bathed, and put in my suite with 4 men on the door. Gino nodded sharply, pulling out his phone. Mateo leaned down, resting his large, calloused hands gently on the marble counter in front of the twins. Leo. Mia. Look at me. The children looked up, their eyes wide. I am your father. Mateo said the truth, finally settling into his bones, heavy and permanent. This is your home now. No one will ever go hungry here again. And the scary men who took your mother, I am going to find them, and I'm going to make them wish they were never born. By 5 a.m., the Muttontown estate had transformed from a quiet mansion into a fortified war room. Heavy SUVs idled in the circular driveway, their headlights piercing the relentless rain. Dozens of heavily armed men in dark suits moved with lethal purpose, loading tactical gear and securing the perimeter. Inside, Dr. Aris Rossi, a discreet physician who had patched up countless bullet holes for the syndicate, gently examined the twins in Mateo's master suite. He confirmed they were severely malnourished, dehydrated, and suffering from mild exposure, but remarkably unharmed. After a warm bath drawn by the housekeeper, they were dressed in oversized t-shirts and tucked into Mateo's massive king-sized bed, instantly falling into a deep, exhausted sleep. Matteo stood in the doorway of the bedroom, watching their chests rise and fall. He felt a phantom pain in his ribs, a physical manifestation of the 5 years he had lost. Lily had faked her death. Why? To protect them from his enemies or to protect them from him? Matteo. He turned. Gino stood in the hallway, dripping wet, holding a tactical tablet. "We found the car," Gino said grimly. "My trackers swept the preserve. It's an old Honda Civic parked deep in the brush near the Jericho Turnpike boundary. You need to see this." 10 minutes later, Matteo was stepping out of a black Range Rover into the muddy, rain-soaked woods. The yellow beams of high-powered flashlights cut through the darkness. A team of his men had secured the area around a rusted blue sedan. Matteo approached the vehicle. The back passenger window had been smashed from the inside Leo's desperate escape route. Inside the cramped car were the pathetic remnants of Lily's life on the run. 2 tattered baby blankets, a half-empty box of generic cereal, a pile of cheap diapers, and a worn nursing textbook used as a makeshift pillow. "Boss over here," one of the men called out. Matteo walked to the front of the car. The driver's side door was hanging open. The mud on the ground was violently churned up, indicating a fierce struggle. And there, stark and horrific against the wet grass, was a pool of dark, congealing blood. Matteo's vision tunneled. He knelt in the mud, staring at the crimson stain. Beside it lay a broken silver chain holding a small St. Jude medallion. It was the necklace he had given Lily on her 21st birthday. They ambushed her when she came back from getting food. Gino deduced, shining his light on a scattered bag of groceries a few feet away. She fought back, hard. Look at the tire tracks. Heavy vehicle, dually truck, maybe a van, headed west on 25A. "Did they leave anything else?" Matteo asked, his voice deathly hollow. Gino hesitated, then handed over a small clear evidence bag. Inside was a brass shell casing. 9mm subsonic, not standard street ammo, it's professional. Valenti. Matteo spat the name like poison. The Valenti brothers, Marco and Vincent, were sadists. If they had Lily. Matteo stood up, wiping the mud from his tailored trousers. He looked at Gino, his slate-gray eyes entirely devoid of humanity. "We are going to Queens. Tear apart every front the Valentis have. I want every warehouse burning, every shipment sunk, and every low-level associate they have bleeding until someone talks." "Bah, boss," Gino warned gently. "If we go in guns blazing, Marco Valenti will know we're coming. He might put a bullet in her to spite you." "If Marco Valenti puts a scratch on her, I will skin him alive and broadcast it to the 5 boroughs," Matteo growled, walking back to the SUV. "Get Carmine on the line. I want his crew mobilized. Call the harbor master, shut down the ports. Nobody leaves Long Island. Nobody leaves Queens. Not until I have my wife back." By 7 a.m., the underworld of New York City was violently awakened. The Moretti syndicate hit the streets like a hurricane. 3 illegal gambling parlors in Astoria were firebombed. A shipment of stolen luxury cars belonging to the Valenti operation was driven off the piers in Red Hook. Matteo himself kicked in the door of a dingy, smoke-filled dive bar in Sunnyside. The patrons screamed and scattered as Matteo, Gino, and 4 enforcers stormed the room. Matteo walked straight to a booth in the back where a terrified, greasy-haired man named Frankie, a known Valenti informant, was desperately trying to climb out a window. Gino grabbed Frankie by the collar and slammed him onto the sticky wooden table, scattering beer bottles. Matteo leaned over him, pulling a terrifyingly sharp hunting knife from his belt. He slammed the blade into the wood half an inch from Frankie's fingers. "Frankie Bichos," Matteo said smoothly, though the rage underneath was boiling over. "You're going to tell me where Marco Valenti is keeping the woman he took off the Jericho Turnpike 3 nights ago. If you lie to me, I'm going to take pieces of you home to feed to my dogs." "I don't know nothing about no woman, Moretti, I swear to God," Frankie sobbed, struggling against Gino's grip. Matteo didn't blink. He pulled the knife out of the table and dragged the flat of the blade against Frankie's cheek. Wrong answer. Wait, Frankie shrieked as the edge pressed into his skin. Okay, Marco didn't grab her. It wasn't Marco. Matteo paused, the blade still resting against the informant's flesh. Who then? Frankie swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically. It was his brother, Vincent. He's been tracking her for months, but boss, you gotta understand, the Valentis didn't put the hit out on you 5 years ago. They didn't bomb the car on the BQE. What are you talking about? Matteo demanded, grabbing Frankie by the throat. They were paid to do it. Frankie gasped out, his face turning purple. By someone inside your house. They tracked the girl to finish the job they were paid for. Matteo froze. The air in the dive bar seemed to turn to ice. Someone inside his house. Who? Matteo roared, slamming Frankie back against the table. Give me a name. I don't know the name, Frankie cried. I just know Vincent took her to the old abandoned slaughterhouse in the meatpacking district. He's waiting for the buyer to come pay for the body. You gotta hurry, Moretti. He's supposed to kill her at noon. Matteo dropped the man. He looked at his gold Rolex. It was 8:15 a.m. He had less than 4 hours. Matteo turned on his heel, striding out of the bar into the pale morning light of Queens. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city slick and cold. He looked up at the towering skyline across the river, a dark promise settling in his chest. Someone in his own family had betrayed him. Someone had robbed him of his wife, forced his children to starve in the woods, and tried to end his bloodline. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed a number. Gino, send every man we have to the meatpacking district. We are going to war. The heavily armored black Cadillac Escalade tore across the Queensboro Bridge, its massive V8 engine roaring over the desolate gray morning traffic. Rain had begun to fall again, hammering against the bulletproof glass like handfuls of thrown gravel. Inside the cavernous cabin, the tension was suffocating. Matteo sat in the back seat, his jaw clenched so tightly, his teeth ached meticulously, loading armor-piercing rounds into a fresh magazine for his Sig Sauer MCX assault rifle. His movements were mechanical, driven by a cold, murderous precision. Every metallic click of a bullet sliding into the magazine was a countdown to the violence he was about to unleash. Gino rode shotgun, coordinating the assault via a secured encrypted tablet. We have 3 teams moving into position, Gino reported, his voice tight. We've locked down the perimeter around Gansevoort and Washington Street. The target is an old condemned meat processing plant. 6 stories of rotting brick and rusted steel. Thermal imaging shows at least 12 heat signatures on the 2nd floor. That's where they are holding our boss. They have armed guards on the roof and at the loading docks. Take out the roof guards quietly. Matteo ordered, his voice devoid of any human warmth. Snipers with suppressors. I don't want a single alarm tripped. I want to walk into that building before Vincent Valenti even realizes he's breathing his final breaths. Understood, Gino replied, tapping the screen. Matteo stared out the rain-streaked window as the Manhattan skyline loomed closer. His mind was a chaotic vortex of agony and rage. For 5 years, he'd visited an empty grave in a sprawling Brooklyn cemetery, laying white roses on cold granite, believing the only woman who had ever looked at him with love instead of fear was nothing but ash. He had punished himself every single day, believing his lifestyle, his enemies, and his sins had dragged an innocent nursing student into a fiery death. Now, knowing she had been alive this entire time, wandering the streets, hiding in freezing cars, raising his children in terrifying poverty just to survive it, broke something fundamental inside him. But the revelation that someone within his own inner circle had orchestrated the bombing was a betrayal so profound, it demanded an ocean of blood. The Escalade skidded to a halt in a narrow, trash-filled alleyway 2 blocks from the target. Matteo stepped out into the freezing downpour, pulling up the collar of his tactical jacket. The cobblestone streets of the meatpacking district were slick and treacherous. A dozen of his best men dressed in heavy tactical gear and carrying suppressed submachine guns materialized from the shadows awaiting his command. Radio silence. Matteo commanded softly, chambering around. No prisoners except Vincent. Vincent is mine. The team moved like phantoms through the labyrinth of alleys, approaching the rusted rear loading doors of the abandoned slaughterhouse. The stench of old decay and wet rust hung heavy in the air. 2 Valenti guards stood by the entrance, smoking cigarettes and shivering in the damp cold. Before they could even register the approaching shadows, 2 muted thwips cut through the sound of the rain. Both men dropped instantly to the wet concrete dark pools expanding beneath their heads. Matteo stepped over their bodies, signaling his breacher. A specialized hydraulic ram was placed against the heavy iron door. With a quiet, agonizing groan of protesting metal, the door gave way. The interior of the slaughterhouse was a cavernous nightmare of hanging metal hooks, rusted conveyor belts, and peeling lead paint. The only illumination came from a few flickering industrial work lights strung up by extension cords. Matteo moved with terrifying speed and lethal efficiency, clearing the ground floor in seconds. They located the stairwell leading to the second floor, the metal steps slick with years of grime. As they ascended, the muffled sound of a man's harsh, cruel laughter echoed down the shaft. It was Vincent Valenti. Matteo's vision went entirely red. He didn't wait for his team to form up. He kicked open the fire door to the second floor with bone-shattering force, tearing the rusted hinges straight out of the brick wall. The room was vast, filled with rusted meatpacking machinery. At the far end, surrounded by 8 heavily armed mercenaries, stood Vincent Valenti, a vicious, scarred man in a tailored suit. And there, tied to a heavy steel chair, bleeding from a cut above her brow, was Lily. Her beautiful soft face was pale, and bruised her blonde hair matted with dried mud and blood. She looked exhausted, broken, and terrified. But the moment the door crashed open, her head snapped up. Through the dim flickering light, her ocean blue eyes locked onto Matteo's. Matteo. She screamed, her voice tearing through the cavernous room, a desperate, agonizing sound that shattered the remaining pieces of his heart. "Kill him!" Vincent roared, drawing his weapon and diving behind a rusted steel vat. The room instantly erupted into a deafening storm of gunfire. Muzzle flashes illuminated the dark warehouse like strobe lights. Matteo didn't dive for cover. He became an unstoppable force of nature, walking straight into the hail of bullets. He raised his Sig Sauer and fired with terrifying mechanical accuracy. 2 of Vincent's men dropped immediately, their body armor useless against the specialized rounds. Gino and the rest of the Moretti crew flooded the room, flanking the remaining mercenaries. The firefight was brutally short and mercilessly violent. Matteo's men were trained assassins. Vincent's were street thugs playing out of their league. Within 60 seconds, the echoing boom of gunfire faded, replaced by the groans of dying men and the harsh hiss of the rain outside. Every single Valenti guard lay dead on the concrete floor. Matteo dropped his empty rifle. He drew his Glock and walked slowly toward the rusted vat where Vincent was hiding. Vincent blindly fired 2 shots around the corner, but the bullets sparked harmlessly against the brick wall. With lightning speed, Matteo lunged around the vat, kicking the gun out of Vincent's hand with a sickening crunch of breaking fingers. Vincent screamed, falling to his knees. Before the man could beg, Matteo drove the heavy steel toe of his combat boot directly into Vincent's jaw, shattering the bone. Vincent collapsed onto the blood-stained concrete, gagging and spitting teeth. Matteo stood over him, a terrifying titan of wrath, the barrel of his Glock pressed firmly against the back of Vincent's skull. "Who paid you?" Matteo asked, his voice, a low demonic whisper that vibrated with absolute malice. Vincent whimpered, clutching his destroyed jaw. You can't." Matteo fired a single shot into Vincent's left kneecap. The sound of the gunshot was entirely drowned out by Vincent's agonizing, high-pitched scream. "I won't ask again," Matteo said gently, stepping heavily onto the shattered knee. "Give me the name of the rat in my house, Vincent, or I will start shooting pieces off you until you bleed out on this filthy floor." Sweat and blood poured down Vincent's face. He looked up at Matteo, his eyes wide with pure, unadulterated terror. He knew he was a dead man, but the pain was beyond human endurance. "Romano!" Vincent screamed, sobbing violently. "It was Carlo Romano, your consigliere. He paid us to plant the bomb. He said you were getting soft, that the girl was making you weak. He wanted to take over the family. Please, God, just kill me." Matteo froze. Carlo. The man who had raised him after his own father died. The man who had taught him how to shoot, how to lead, how to survive. The betrayal was a jagged blade twisting directly into his spine. "Thank you," Matteo whispered. He pulled the trigger. The echoing crack of the gunshot faded into the grim silence of the slaughterhouse, leaving only the steady drum of rain hitting the rusted roof. Matteo didn't look at Vincent's lifeless body. He holstered his weapon and turned slowly. Across the room, amidst the carnage and the smoke, sat the woman he had mourned for 1,825 days. Lily was trembling violently against the heavy ropes binding her to the steel chair. Her wide, terrified blue eyes flickered from the bodies on the floor to Matteo. She was hyperventilating the brutal reality of the violence surrounding her, clashing with the sheer impossible shock of seeing him alive and standing before her. Matteo crossed the distance between them in 3 massive strides. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the pool of blood seeping into his trousers, and pulled a tactical knife from his belt. Lily flinched, turning her face away and squeezing her eyes shut, expecting a strike. The reaction gutted him. He carefully slipped the blade beneath the thick ropes binding her wrists and sliced through them with immense care. He threw the ropes aside and dropped the knife, holding his large, calloused hands up in surrender. "Lily." He breathed, his voice cracking, entirely devoid of the monster he had been just moments ago. "It's me. I'm here. You're safe." Lily slowly opened her eyes. She stared at his face, the sharp jawline she used to trace with her fingertips, the slate-gray eyes she had dreamed of every night in her miserable, freezing exile. A sob tore from her throat. She didn't hesitate. She threw her battered, bruised arms around his neck, burying her face into the cold, wet fabric of his tactical jacket. Matteo wrapped his massive arms around her fragile frame, crushing her to his chest. He buried his face in her matted blonde hair, inhaling the faint scent of rain and vanilla that he thought he would never smell again. He squeezed his eyes shut as hot, desperate tears streamed down his face, completely unbothered by Gino and his men securing the perimeter behind them. "I thought I lost you," Matteo choked out, rocking her gently as she sobbed violently against his chest. "I buried an empty casket. I thought you burned on the expressway. Why, Lily? Why did you run? Why didn't you come to me?" Lily pulled back slightly, her hands trembling as she cupped his face. Her thumbs brushed away the tears on his cheeks. "The day of the explosion," she whispered, her voice hoarse and broken. "Carlo came to the apartment. He told me you ordered the hit. He told me you found out I was pregnant and decided I was a liability. He said if I didn't disappear forever, he would make sure my babies died before they even took their first breath." Matteo's blood turned to absolute ice. The sheer calculating evil of Carlo's lie paralyzed him. Carlo had used Matteo's own terrifying reputation to convince the woman he loved that he was a monster willing to murder his own unborn children. "I was so terrified, Matteo." Lily wept, her fingers gripping his jacket desperately. "I saw the car explode from the subway platform. I knew they were trying to kill me. I had to protect Leo and Mia. I had to hide them from your world. But it was so hard. We never had enough money. We never had enough food. And then Vincent found us in the woods. He recognized me. He dragged me out of the car, and I fought, Matteo. I swear I fought, but I couldn't stop them." "Shh!" Matteo hushed her, pressing his forehead against hers. "You are the bravest woman I have ever known. You kept them alive. You saved them, Lily." "Where are they? Panic suddenly seized her. She grabbed his shoulders, her eyes wide and frantic. "Where are my babies? He left them in the woods. It's freezing, Mateo. They're going to die out there." "They're safe," Mateo interrupted softly, gripping her hands to ground her. "Lily, look at me. They are safe. They are asleep in my bed at the estate. A doctor has looked at them. They are warm, and they are fed, and they are protected by an army. Leo broke the car window. He brought Mia to the house. He showed me the Polaroid. They're safe, my love." Lily stared at him, the terrifying tension slowly draining from her exhausted muscles. The realization that her children had survived, that they had found their father, finally broke her completely. She collapsed against him, weeping uncontrollably, the crushing weight of 5 years of profound terror and crushing poverty finally lifting from her fragile shoulders. Mateo scooped her up into his arms effortlessly, standing tall amidst the ruins of the slaughterhouse. She weighed absolutely nothing, a stark, painful reminder of how much she had sacrificed to keep their children alive. "Gino," Mateo called out, his voice echoing in the cold room. Gino stepped forward, his face grave, but a distinct look of intense relief shining in his eyes as he looked at Lily. "Yes, boss." "Get the medic! Have the SUV warmed up," Mateo ordered, carrying Lily toward the stairwell. "We're going home, but first you are going to call Carlo Romano. Tell him I need an emergency sit-down at the estate tonight. Tell him it's a matter of absolute syndicate security." "He's going to suspect a trap," Mateo, Gino warned. "If he thinks we know." "He won't," Mateo replied, his slate-gray eyes hardening into solid, unforgiving steel. "Tell him the Valenti brothers just made a move on our Long Island territory. Tell him I need my consigliere's advice. Play to his massive ego. He won't be able to resist walking into my house to see how weak he thinks I am." Gino nodded slowly, a dark, understanding smirk crossing his face. "Consider it done. What do you want us to do when he gets there?" Mateo looked down at Lily, who had passed out from sheer exhaustion against his chest, her breathing finally evening out into a steady rhythm. He tightened his protective grip on her, the furious wrath of a vengeful father and husband, burning a hole straight through his soul. "You bring him to the basement," Mateo said, his voice entirely dead of emotion, a promise of unspeakable violence. "And you lay out the heavy plastic. Carlo Romano took 5 years of my life. He starved my children. He tortured my wife. Tonight the Moretti family cleans its own house, and we are going to use bleach and fire." The drive back to the Muttontown estate was a silent, surreal journey through the gray, rain-swept streets of New York. The heavily armored black Cadillac Escalade, usually a vessel of intimidation and power, now served as a delicate ambulance for the broken remnants of Mateo's heart. He sat in the spacious rear cabin, holding Lily across his lap. She was wrapped in his heavy tactical jacket, her exhausted, battered body trembling slightly despite the blasting heat of the vehicle. Mateo held her with a terrifying gentleness, terrified that if he squeezed too hard, this impossible miracle would shatter and vanish into the mist. As they passed through the towering wrought iron gates of the estate, the massive compound felt entirely different to him. For half a decade, it had been a cold, untouchable fortress designed solely to keep his enemies out. Now, as the heavy tires crunched over the gravel driveway, it transformed. It was a sanctuary heavily fortified and bristling with armed guards, built strictly to keep his fragile, fractured family completely insulated from the horrors of the world. Mateo carried Lily through the grand marble foyer. The household staff individuals, who usually moved like invisible ghosts, stood frozen in the hallways. They watched with wide, shocked eyes as the Don, a man known for his ruthless, emotionless demeanor, carried a bruised, weeping woman up the sweeping central staircase with the reverence of a man carrying a sacred relic. Gino trailed closely behind his face, a mask of grim determination, barking quiet, rapid-fire orders into his radio, locking down the perimeter and securing the subterranean levels of the mansion. In the master suite, Dr. Aris Rossi was waiting. He took one look at Lily's pale, bruised form and immediately went to work. Mateo refused to leave the room. He stood rigidly by the towering bay windows, his massive hands shoved deep into his pockets, his knuckles white. He watched in agonizing silence as the doctor gently cleaned the deep, jagged laceration above Lily's brow, carefully checked her erratic vitals, and hooked her frail arm up to an intravenous drip of hydration fluids and heavy antibiotics. She is severely dehydrated and dangerously exhausted. Matteo, Dr. Rossi whispered, carefully packing his medical instruments into his leather bag. Her body has been running on pure terrified adrenaline for days. The bruising on her ribs and shoulders is extensive, likely from a violent struggle, but thankfully nothing is broken. She needs uninterrupted rest, heavy nutrition, and time. But above all else, Matteo, she needs to feel completely safe. She will never know another moment of fear as long as she draws breath. Matteo replied, his voice a low, gravelly vow that seemed to vibrate against the thick glass of the window. Dr. Rossi nodded silently, understanding the lethal weight of that promise, and slipped quietly out of the bedroom. Matteo slowly approached the massive king-sized bed. Lily looked incredibly small and fragile amidst the dark, heavy silk sheets. Her breathing was steady now, the frantic, panicked edge finally gone, replaced by the deep rhythm of absolute exhaustion. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany doors of the adjoining sitting room creaked open. A tiny, messy head of dark hair peeked nervously around the doorframe. Leo. Behind him, clutching tightly to her brother's oversized shirt, was Mia. They had woken up from their exhausted slumber. They were clean now, their faces scrubbed of the mud and grime, but the deep, lingering weariness in their small bodies was still painfully evident. Leo's bright ocean blue eyes darted cautiously around the massive, unfamiliar room, finally landing on the bed. He froze. His little jaw dropped and a soft, trembling gasp escaped his lips, shattering the quiet of the room. "Mommy!" Leo whispered the single word, carrying a devastating weight of fragile hope and lingering, desperate terror. Lily stirred instantly at the sound of her son's voice. Her heavy eyelids fluttered open. She turned her head against the pillows, wincing slightly against the dull, throbbing ache in her skull. When her gaze fell upon the two tiny, hesitant figures standing in the doorway, a choked, agonizing sob tore itself from her bruised throat. She pushed herself up against the headboard, completely ignoring the painful pull of the IV line taped to the back of her hand, and reached out her trembling arms. "Leo! Mia!" Lily cried out, hot tears streaming rapidly down her face. "My babies! Oh God, my babies, come here!" Leo didn't hesitate for another second. He sprinted across the plush carpet, dragging his sister behind him. They scrambled frantically up the side of the massive mattress and threw themselves recklessly into their mother's open arms. The three of them collapsed into a tangled, desperate pile, sobbing openly, clutching at one another as if letting go would mean disappearing into the nightmare forever. Matteo stood paralyzed at the foot of the bed, entirely overwhelmed by the sheer staggering magnitude of the scene before him. He watched his brave, ferocious 4-year-old son bury his face deep into his mother's neck, finally allowing himself to be a vulnerable child again. He watched his beautiful, delicate daughter fiercely clutch Lily's blonde hair, her tiny shoulders shaking with silent, relieved sobs. A solitary tear escaped Matteo's hardened, slate-gray eyes, tracking slowly down his cheek. This was everything he had been robbed of. 5 entire years of first steps, of scraped knees, of chaotic bath times and quiet, peaceful mornings. All of it stolen by a man who had smiled in his face, drank his expensive wine, and claimed to be family. Lily looked up through her thick tears, locking her ocean blue eyes with Matteo's gray ones. She slowly extended one trembling hand toward him. It was a silent invitation, a fragile bridge constructed over the vast, bloody chasm of the last 5 years. Matteo stepped forward and sank heavily onto the edge of the mattress. He wrapped his massive, powerful arms around all 3 of them, pulling them securely against his broad chest. He buried his face against Lily's warm forehead, his strong jaw resting against Leo's dark hair, his large hand gently cradling the back of Mia's head. For the first time in half a decade, the crushing, suffocating darkness inside Mateo shattered, completely replaced by a blinding, overwhelming light. I've got you," Mateo whispered fiercely into the quiet room, his voice thick with raw, unfiltered emotion. "I've got all of you. Nobody will ever touch you again. I swear it on my soul." They stayed tangled together for hours until the twins finally fell back into a deep, peaceful sleep, nestled securely against their mother's side. The gray afternoon light slowly faded, casting long, dark shadows across the bedroom floor. Lily gently stroked Leo's hair, her eyes fixated on the window. "They were going to kill me, Mateo," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "When Vincent dragged me out of the car, he told me that Carlo wanted proof. He wanted a picture of my dead body before he paid the rest of the bounty." Mateo's jaw tightened, the muscles ticking dangerously beneath his skin. "Carlo will never hurt another living thing in this world, Lily. I promise you that." Lily turned her head, her blue eyes pleading desperately. "Mateo, please. After tonight, no more blood. I cannot raise our children in a world where we are constantly looking over our shoulders in terror. I cannot watch them inherit a war." Mateo leaned down, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to her bruised temple. "Tonight is the absolute end. I'm going to tear the rot out of my house by the roots, and tomorrow we begin again, just us." He stood up slowly, ensuring the heavy blanket was tucked securely around his sleeping family. He straightened his tailored black shirt, the vulnerable weeping father vanishing entirely, instantly replaced by the terrifying, ruthless apex predator of the New York underworld. It was time to welcome his guest. The sleek silver Mercedes-Benz S-Class glided smoothly up the long, winding driveway of the Muttontown estate, just as the pale moon finally broke through the heavy, lingering cloud cover. The night air was bitter and cold, thick with the scent of damp earth and impending, unspeakable violence. Carlo Romano sat comfortably in the luxurious back seat, nursing a crystal glass of expensive bourbon from the vehicle's minibar. At 62, Carlo was a man who exuded generational wealth and calculated, manipulative authority. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his bespoke Italian suit entirely free of wrinkles. He had served as the trusted consigliere to Matteo's father, and then to Matteo himself, successfully positioning himself as the wise, untouchable architect behind the Moretti family's ruthless, bloody expansion. But beneath the polished veneer, Carlo was a man completely consumed by his own insatiable greed and blistering arrogance. He viewed Matteo not as a strong leader, but as a rabid, unpredictable dog that needed to be put down before it ruined the lucrative business. Lily had been a massive distraction, a glaring weakness that made Matteo unforgivably human. And in Carlo's ruthless world, humanity was a fatal disease that had to be eradicated. The Mercedes came to a smooth halt in front of the grand illuminated portico. Carlo stepped out, confidently adjusting his silk tie. He fully expected Gino to greet him at the heavy mahogany doors, perhaps looking panicked and disorganized about this supposed sudden Valenti invasion. Instead, the massive front doors were standing wide open, revealing the cavernous, dimly lit foyer. Gino stepped out of the dark shadows of the entrance. He wasn't wearing his usual tailored designer suit. He was dressed entirely in tactical black gear, his customized assault rifle slung ominously across his broad chest. His expression was a blank, terrifying void. "Carlo," Gino said, his voice completely devoid of the usual respect. Carlo frowned deeply, instantly irritated by the capo's insolent tone. "Gino, where is Matteo? This Valenti business is a ridiculous headache we do not need right now. I have a strategy prepared. Take me to his study immediately." "He's not in the study," Gino replied coldly, stepping aside and gesturing toward the long, narrow corridor that led to the servants' quarters and the lower subterranean levels. "He's waiting for you downstairs." "Downstairs?" Carlos scoffed, his irritation flashing into genuine indignant anger. What kind of foolish nonsense is this? I am the consigliere of this family. I do not conduct serious syndicate business in a basement like some low-level street thug. The Don requested your presence downstairs, Carlo. Are you going to keep him waiting? Gino's hand subtly shifted, coming to rest mere inches from the grip of his holstered sidearm. A faint, chilling prickle of genuine unease crawled slowly up Carlo's spine. He looked around the empty, cavernous foyer. The absolute dead silence of the massive house suddenly felt suffocating and unnatural. He nodded stiffly, swallowing his immense pride, and followed Gino down the dimly lit hallway. They reached the heavy, reinforced steel security door that led to the basement levels of the estate. Gino keyed in a complex code, and the heavy door swung open with a loud metallic groan. Carlo descended the steep concrete stairs, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply and rhythmically in the echoing darkness. The basement was a massive, sprawling space, usually reserved for storing illegal contraband weapons and untraceable currency. Tonight, however, it had been meticulously cleared. As Carlo reached the bottom step, his breath caught painfully in his throat. The entire concrete floor, stretching from wall to concrete wall, was covered in thick, heavy, translucent plastic sheeting. Two blindingly bright industrial halogen work lights stood in the exact center of the room, casting harsh, unforgiving shadows against the bare walls. And standing directly in the center of the plastic, casually holding a heavy rusted iron crowbar, was Matteo Moretti. Matteo had removed his jacket and rolled up the sleeves of his black dress shirt, revealing the intricate sprawling tattoos of the syndicate covering his powerful forearms. He looked entirely relaxed, yet radiated a terrifying, lethal energy that made the cold air in the room feel heavy and suffocating. Carlo stopped dead in his tracks. His heart began to hammer violently against his ribs. The initial unease rapidly morphed into blinding, suffocating terror. He looked frantically back over his shoulder, but Gino had already locked the heavy steel door from the inside and was standing impassively on the stairs, blocking the only exit. Matteo. Carlo managed to say, his voice shaking as he forced a strained artificial smile onto his pale face. What? What is all this? Where is the Valenti crisis we need to discuss? There is no Valenti crisis. Carlo, Matteo said smoothly, his deep voice echoing menacingly off the concrete walls. He slowly began to pace around the perimeter of the plastic, dragging the heavy iron crowbar across the ground. The metallic screech set Carlo's teeth on edge. Vincent Valenti is dead. I put a bullet directly between his eyes at 8 o'clock this morning. Carlo's stomach violently plummeted. He suddenly felt entirely numb, all the blood draining completely from his face. Vincent is dead, he stammered, fighting desperately to keep his composure. Well, that is excellent news, Matteo. A decisive, strong victory for the family. But I still don't understand why we are down here in the dark. Matteo stopped pacing. He turned slowly, locking his cold, slate-gray eyes onto Carlo. The look was entirely devoid of mercy or hesitation. It was the look of a man staring at a condemned ghost he was about to banish to hell. Vincent was very talkative before he died. Carlo. Matteo whispered, his voice dangerously soft, carrying across the silent room. He told me a fascinating story. He told me about a greedy coward hiding in my inner circle, a man who paid him a fortune to plant a bomb on the BQE 5 years ago, a man who paid him to hunt down an innocent nursing student and 2 starving children in the freezing woods of Muttontown. Carlo stumbled backward, his knees turning to water. Matteo, no. Whatever that lying rat told you, it was a fabrication, a desperate, pathetic lie to save his own miserable life. You know me, I raised you, I served your father with honor. Do not ever invoke my father's name, Matteo roared, the explosive, terrifying volume of his voice violently shaking the dust from the ceiling rafters. He threw the crowbar with terrifying force. It slammed into the concrete wall mere inches from Carlo's head, with a deafening crack shattering a solid cinder block into pieces. Carlo screamed, his legs giving out entirely as he collapsed onto his knees on the heavy plastic sheeting. He held his shaking hands up, hot tears of pure, unadulterated terror streaming down his wrinkled face. "Matteo, please, you have to listen to me. She was making you weak and soft. The family was losing respect on the streets. I did it to protect the syndicate. I did it for the Moretti legacy." Matteo walked slowly, deliberately toward the kneeling traitor, his heavy combat boots making absolutely no sound against the plastic. He looked down at the pathetic, trembling man who had stolen his life, who had forced his beautiful children to starve in the freezing rain while he drank expensive bourbon. "You didn't do it for the legacy," Matteo said, his voice dropping back to a cold, dead whisper. "You did it for power. You wanted the throne, but you miscalculated Carlo. You forgot what kind of violent monster you helped create." Matteo reached into his waistband and slowly, methodically drew his Glock 19. He racked the slide, the sharp, metallic click sounding like a thunderclap in the silent, tense basement. "She is alive, Carlo," Matteo stated, deeply relishing the look of absolute, soul-crushing despair that violently washed over the older man's face. "Lily is upstairs, sleeping safely in my bed. My brave son and my beautiful daughter are safe. You failed completely. You lost everything." Carlo sobbed violently, bowing his head in total defeat to the plastic floor. "Mercy, Matteo, I beg of you. Have mercy on an old man." Matteo raised the weapon, pointing the barrel directly at the back of Carlo's silver head. The haunting image of Leo's starving face and Mia's terrified, tear-filled eyes burned brightly in his mind, fueling the righteous executioner standing in the dark. "The Moretti family has no mercy for traitors," Matteo whispered. He pulled the trigger. The deafening roar of the gunshot echoed violently through the subterranean chamber, bringing a brutal, permanent silence to the Judas of Muttontown and washing the terrible sins of the past away in a sudden tide of righteous blood. The thick, suffocating scent of gunpowder and copper lingered heavily in the subterranean basement of the estate. Matteo handed the smoking weapon to Gino, his expression completely unreadable. There was no triumphant satisfaction in taking the life of his former mentor. There was only a cold, absolutely necessary eradication of a terminal disease that had threatened the very existence of his fragile family. "Clean this up entirely," Matteo ordered softly, his voice completely devoid of adrenaline or rage. "Burn the heavy plastic. Incinerate the remains at the private Red Hook industrial facility. By sunrise, I want absolutely no physical or paper trace that Carlo Romano ever existed on this earth. He is a ghost." Gino nodded curtly, his face stoic as he pulled out a heavily encrypted burner phone to summon the syndicate's discreet cleanup crew. Matteo turned away from the gruesome scene and walked deliberately back up the steep concrete stairs. As he crossed the threshold into the opulent main house, he paused inside the sprawling marble bathroom near the grand foyer. He turned on the heavy gold-plated faucets, letting the scalding hot water rush violently over his calloused hands. He scrubbed his skin meticulously with a stiff bristle brush, watching the pale pink soap suds spiral endlessly down the silver drain. He wasn't simply washing away the dark chemical residue of gunshot. He was forcefully and permanently scrubbing away the monster he used to be. The ruthless, bloodthirsty Mafia Boss had died in that cold basement alongside the traitor. The man walking silently up the sweeping central staircase to his deeply traumatized sleeping wife was simply a devoted father and a fiercely protective husband. By 8 o'clock the following morning, the atmosphere inside the Muttontown estate had shifted drastically. Matteo convened an emergency mandatory meeting with his 4 remaining capos in the sprawling mahogany boardroom overlooking the lavish gardens. The men sat nervously in their tailored Italian suits, highly anticipating a brutal, bloody street war following the sudden demise of both the Valenti brothers and their own esteemed consigliere. Matteo stood at the head of the long table wearing a crisp, understated white dress shirt. He looked entirely different. The chaotic, violent edge that usually defined him was gone, replaced by a terrifyingly calm, absolute authority. The old ways of the Moretti family are officially dead. Matteo announced his deep voice, leaving absolutely no room for debate or hesitation. Effective immediately, we are liquidating all illicit street-level operations. There will be no more extortion rackets in Queens, no more illegal gambling parlors in Brooklyn, and absolutely no blood spilled over petty turf disputes. We are taking the entire syndicate completely legitimate. The capos stared at him in stunned, deafening silence. Finally, a heavily scarred enforcer named Lorenzo cleared his throat nervously. "Boss, with all due respect, if we suddenly lay down our weapons and pull our men off the streets, the rival Costa family will immediately see it as a fatal weakness. Dominic Costa has been aggressively eyeing our lucrative shipping docks for 3 years. He will attack us by nightfall." "Let him try," Matteo replied coldly, a razor-sharp, calculating smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Dominic Costa is an uneducated thug fighting a 20th century war with bullets. We are moving into the 21st century. The dramatic twist of Matteo's brilliant strategy unfolded mere hours later. Just as Lorenzo predicted, Dominic Costa attempted to forcefully seize the lucrative Red Hook shipping terminals by sending 3 heavily armed vans of mercenaries to intimidate the dock workers. But instead of deploying his own ruthless hitmen to engage in a devastating public bloodbath that would terrify Lily, Matteo picked up his phone and executed a flawless, devastating corporate ambush. Over the past 5 years, Matteo had quietly amassed billions in clean, laundered capital. He immediately deployed a ruthless team of elite corporate attorneys from the prestigious Manhattan law firm Cravath, Swaine & Moore, alongside aggressive hedge fund managers from J.P. Morgan Chase. Through a complex web of anonymous shell companies registered in Delaware, Matteo swiftly executed a hostile, devastating financial takeover of Dominic Costa's legitimate front companies. He legally bought out Costa's primary commercial real estate holdings, aggressively froze the rival family's vast offshore banking assets through highly coordinated federal injunctions, and utterly bankrupted the Costa empire before the sun even set. Costa's armed mercenaries at the docks received frantic phone calls from their panicked bosses, entirely realizing their paychecks had vanished into thin air. Without a single bullet fired, the rival family completely collapsed into absolute, irreversible ruin. When Matteo walked back into his master suite that evening, the television was softly playing the breaking financial news of the Costa Enterprises' sudden, shocking bankruptcy. Lily was sitting comfortably in a plush armchair by the bay window, wearing a soft, luxurious cashmere sweater, her painful bruises slowly beginning to fade into a dull yellow. She looked from the glowing television screen to her husband, her ocean blue eyes wide with a profound emotional realization. He hadn't sent men to die. He hadn't brought violence back to their doorstep. He had kept his sacred promise. "You really did it," Lily whispered, fresh, overwhelming tears welling in her beautiful eyes. "You stopped the war." Matteo crossed the bedroom and knelt gently before her, resting his large hands securely on her knees. "I told you, my love, the monster is gone. From now on, I am only yours." 6 peaceful, transformative months later, the golden, warming rays of the early spring sun washed beautifully over the sprawling, meticulously manicured grounds of the Muttontown estate. The heavy, oppressive gloom that had violently haunted the massive property for half a decade had been completely eradicated. The towering, intimidating iron gates remained securely locked and guarded, but inside the perimeter, it was a vibrant, joyous sanctuary bursting with new life. Out on the expansive, sun-drenched stone terrace, joyful, infectious laughter echoed brilliantly through the crisp morning air. Leo, sporting a miniature, perfectly tailored Ralph Lauren polo shirt and clean denim jeans, was excitedly chasing a golden retriever puppy across the pristine green lawns. Little Mia, wearing a bright yellow sundress and a delicate crown of woven daisies, was sitting happily near a grand marble fountain, completely mesmerized as she enthusiastically ate a warm, powdered Nutella crepe prepared personally by the estate's private five-star executive chef. They were no longer the frail, terrified, starving ghosts who had desperately snuck into a dangerous pantry. They were healthy, radiant, deeply loved children who finally knew absolute safety. Mateo stood proudly on the elevated balcony, nursing a steaming mug of imported black coffee, his silver Rolex catching the bright morning light. He watched his beautiful children play with a profound, overwhelming sense of inner peace that he never truly believed he would ever experience in his lifetime. The vast corporate transition of his former criminal empire was an undeniable, staggering success. He was now heavily respected as a legitimate, untouchable titan of New York commercial real estate, trading his illegal assault rifles for highly complex multi-million-dollar corporate contracts. Soft, barefoot footsteps gently approached from behind. Two delicate arms wrapped lovingly around his broad, muscular waist, and a soft, warm cheek pressed intimately against his back. "They are getting so fast," Lily murmured happily, her sweet melodic voice carrying effortlessly over the gentle morning breeze. "I think Leo is actually going to outrun that puppy by next week." Mateo chuckled deeply, a rich, genuine sound that resonated pleasantly in his chest. He turned around smoothly, wrapping his arms protectively around his wife. Lily looked absolutely breathtaking. The deep, agonizing trauma of her harrowing exile in the freezing woods had finally faded, replaced by a stunning, radiant glow of profound happiness. Her blonde hair fell in soft, loose waves around her shoulders, and her striking ocean blue eyes sparkled with a completely untroubled, pure joy. He gets his stubborn, relentless energy directly from his beautiful mother. Mateo teased gently, leaning down to press a soft, lingering kiss against her forehead. Lily smiled gently, resting her hands flat against the solid wall of his chest. She looked up at him, her expression suddenly turning deeply emotional and profoundly serious. "Mateo, there is something highly important I need to tell you. Something I discovered yesterday afternoon when I went into the city for my private medical appointment." A fleeting, irrational spike of terrifying panic momentarily gripped Mateo's heart. His protective instincts immediately flared. "Are you all right? Is something wrong with your health, Lily? Tell me right now." Lily quickly shook her head, a brilliant, dazzling smile breaking through her sudden happy tears. She reached down, taking one of his large, calloused hands, and placed it gently, deliberately over her flat stomach. "Nothing is wrong, my love," Lily whispered, her voice trembling with intense, overwhelming joy. "Everything is completely, perfectly right. We are having another baby." Mateo stopped breathing. The massive, sprawling world around him seemed to halt entirely. He stared at her, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnificent weight of the incredible revelation. 5 years ago, the prospect of a child had violently torn them apart, sending Lily into a terrifying, agonizing exile. But now, in the bright, peaceful light of their newly conquered world, this innocent child represented the ultimate, undeniable victory. This new baby would never know the horrifying sound of gunfire. This child would never have to hide desperately in a freezing, broken car. This baby would only ever know a father who loved them unconditionally, a mother who was profoundly safe, and a massive, fiercely protective family. A baby. Mateo choked out his slate-gray eyes, filling rapidly with hot, undeniable tears of pure gratitude. "Lily, are you serious?" "I am," she laughed, throwing her arms tightly around his neck as he effortlessly swept her up off her feet, spinning her joyfully around the sunlit balcony. Mateo buried his face in her soft neck, holding her as tightly as he possibly could without breaking her. He looked out over the expansive, beautiful estate, watching Leo and Mia laughing happily together in the bright green grass below. The ruthless, terrifying mafia boss was entirely permanently dead. In his place stood a phenomenally wealthy, unbroken man who had successfully fought through the darkest, bloodiest depths of hell just to secure heaven for the people he cherished. "I love you," Matteo whispered fiercely, his voice a permanent, unbreakable vow. "I will spend every single second of the rest of my life making sure you never stop smiling." Thank you so much for watching this incredible story of betrayal, redemption, and the undeniable power of family. If Matteo and Lily's emotional journey touched your heart, please hit that like button to support our channel. Don't forget to share this video with your friends who love intense, thrilling romance dramas. We upload captivating news stories every single week, so make sure you subscribe and click the notification bell so you never miss an episode. What did you think of Carlo's shocking demise? Let us know in the comments below today. We will see you in the next dramatic video.